You're listening to the Empowering Process podcast with your host, Gail Kraft. Listen as she holds frank discussions around how your purpose, being present, and trusting your power impacts your life. Whether you're an entrepreneur, leader, or developing your vision, you'll find wisdom and insights you can utilize right now. Welcome your host, Gail Kraft.
Well, hello, everybody. Gail Kraft here from the Empowering Process podcast. And I have with me today pretty amazing man, Scott Mason. Scott is a myth slayer. We're going to get into that in a little bit. Let me give you a little taste of his history. So Scott says that his biggest struggle has been overcoming an utterly depleted, barren spirituality filled with endless rage and becoming emotionally whole, intact, and in line with the provincial flow. And we'll talk about flow. And to be an actual human, he says, not just on the inside, but on the outside too. To be without something as fundamental as a soul is to appreciate the journey to it, to bringing it back and to living within it. It's ignited my charisma, his charisma. It's transformed his relationships. And it took him from living out an inner infernal, and we'll talk about that, to radiating from within the light and sun itself. And we're going to talk a lot about that and about mythology. Yeah. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. It is so good to be here. I've been so stoked to have this conversation with you. You're singular, and this is going to be a blast.
It's going to be fantastic. Well, I'll tell you, Scott, I mean, we are kindred soul in many ways. Yes. I was raised, my brother says we were raised heathens. We had no religious backbone. No, we didn't go to church. We didn't go to temple. Wow. We didn't do any of that stuff.
Really?
Yes. And so what did that do to the little girl who saw her friends go to their various things? I became very curious.
I bet.
Very curious. What are they doing that I'm not doing? Right? What are they learning that I'm not learning? Right?
The secrets behind the closed
doors. Yes, the fear of missing out, right? So at 12, 13, I had a friend who her father was Jewish, her mother was Italian, her mom and dad were divorced. Her mom was engaged to a Protestant, and she's like, I'm confused. I need to understand this. So her and I locked arms, and every week we would go to a different religious ceremony.
Wow.
And we would walk out and take notes as to what our observations were. It was not good, Scott.
Really?
Right.
In what way? I have to know.
Two Jewish girls in a Christian environment heard a lot of Jew slashing.
Well, that's not good.
Right? In those days. And it made me shut down on religion altogether, which is a good thing because that's constructed religion. But it didn't shut me down from spirituality. It made me more curious. Right? What's beyond those walls? Yes. You know, what's underneath those stories? And so we're going to talk about stories, right? So I was like, what's underneath the Bible stories? The Bible, I looked at it like Aesop's fables. Right? It's trying to tell me something. It's not, I don't believe it really happened, but it's trying to tell me something. Right. So let's talk about mythology and how that actually saved your life, Scott.
It did. It did. Thank you. And what an incredible introduction.
Welcome.
You know, it's interesting, just sort of thinking about everything that you just shared. What immediately comes to mind is that, the nexus between religion and mythology is one that many people are uncomfortable with. And yet, through that discomfort, they deprive themselves of the full opportunity to understand the deeper and timeless meanings and transformational impacts of both mythology and religion. I also can relate very deeply to what you said about exploring the religious communities that you were part of. As I think we've discussed before, maybe we didn't, but I believe we did. I grew up in a fundamentalist community, or if not the most extreme fundamentalist, it was an extraordinarily conservative, literalist, biblical community. And as someone who is LGBTQAI plus, or whatever the current acronym set is, forgive me if I trip up that one. Hey, I still got my cred. It was ultimately something that was alienated, and so I ended up with a similar reaction to religion that you did, based in significant part on a different set of origins, but coming to the same conclusions. Now, my rejection of religion that came from that exploration was very extreme and severe, as you hinted at during the introduction. But that was part of the journey. And sometimes when an early experience with, or at least an initial experience with any sort of system is one that's very hardline, radical, inflexible, and extreme, people can bounce back in the other direction before they're able to even begin to contemplate the middle ground. The middle ground sometimes can only be achieved through the boomerang. You can only rise to the top of the firmament by climbing to the bottom of the Hadean pit.
I love that, the Hadean pit. Yes.
Steal it. Feel free to steal it.
Oh, no, but I will. Well, maybe.
Exactly.
Right. Who knows? I, way back when I was first coaching, did a presentation on change. And I talk about the pit. Right? When we fear change, hey, yay, things are going to change. Oh no, that means it's going to impact my life. Holy crap. Now, what does that mean to me? And so even if it's a marriage, you go through maybe I'm making a mistake, right? And you get into that negative. Now, for many of us, it's a stop. I wallowed in it. As I mentioned earlier, there was a time in my life where I couldn't stand who I was. I got fired from corporate, and the anger and the emotional toxicity I lived in was me wallowing in that. Right. But it was my wake-up call to, hey, this isn't who you are. Right. So we all have a variety of wake-up calls, right? And so you left your family, you left your community.
Yes.
You were actually shunned from it.
I would say that's interesting. The disapproval of who I was and what I represented was made abundantly clear.
Right.
It is interesting. At one point, I had a long-term relationship with someone as an adult once I had entered my professional life here in New York City, where I live. And I wanted to bring my significant other back to Kansas, where I was from, so that they could meet our family. That person could learn more about my origins and get a deeper sense of who I was. I'd been to his hometown and met a lot of the folks that he grew up with, and it did deepen the relationship. I wanted to do the same. And I actually was asked to please not only not come back to my family, but to not come back to the town that I was in at all. So although it had never occurred to me that I might have been shunned, and it's interesting that you use that word because it definitely has a religious, historical tone to it.
Right.
I could say that at least a modest form of shunning was occurring outside of the overt things like you're sinning and you're going to hell and you're an embarrassment to the family and all that sort of stuff that don't necessarily lead to shunning, but they lead to shame.
Oh, let's talk about shame.
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 Yes, the S word.
Yes, I know. Shame is the root of so much. So so you entered the world by yourself, right?
Yes.
With no support,
Yes.
questioning whether or not religion or questioning any belief system,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Right. I know I was agnostic. You were atheist. I was agnostic because I was curious, right? I was curious. Okay, I don't see anything saying no, but I don't see anything saying yes, when in fact, as a child, I did. I had just shut it all out, right? And so tell us about your journey to awakening. I just love these kind of stories.
Thank you. I appreciate you asking. So, a transformational experience in my life that I'll just sort of share as a predicate was when I was at church as an early adult, or maybe very, very late teenager, the church that I grew up in. And the minister, who was very fire and brimstone, asked all of the young adults and teenagers to go down to the altar at the front. He was on a Sodom and Gomorrah and teenage girls out of wedlock tear. And he put his hand on each of our heads as we kneeled and called on God to make sure that none of us were homosexual or having sex out of wedlock, let alone getting pregnant. And I knew, as I was sitting there hearing all of this, that I was gay. I knew that at least one of the young women at that altar was pregnant out of wedlock. She had not announced that publicly and it wasn't visible, but she was. And so I felt both a sense of intense shame and rage, and I also felt a deep sense of compassion for her and how that might be affecting her and how she's going to raise that child, assuming that she was to raise that child upon its birth. And that was maybe a crystallizing moment that led me to begin to say, you know, it's not good enough to doubt this stuff. It's not good enough to have questions. It's not enough to tolerate it as a possibility in my life. For my life to go forward, this has to go out the window. And Gail, out the window it went.
Right.
Now, for many years in the work world, in a way that was liberating, because I was able to develop my own ethical and moral system, which I didn't abandon the idea of morality, but it also gave me the freedom to sort of say, in a way, I could be what I want to be. Now, as you and I have discussed, and I'm sure we'll discuss a little further as this episode goes on, us making the decision about who and what we want to be isn't necessarily true freedom. It's an illusion of it, though. And so as part of that, I took a very, very, I would say, mercenary approach probably to my career. Very aggressive approach. And I had a very strong belief system about those that carried any sort of faith. I categorically lumped them all together, whether you were part of an organized religion or whether you were spiritual or whether you were some hybrid, whatever. People that I would work with that would say, well, God brought me here, or I have faith in a higher power, or my spirituality, or blah, 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 blah. Any of those things, because of my career desires and my cold-blooded, I would say, assessment of how I wanted to interact with people, particularly professionally, I kept silent about it. But inside, make no mistake, I was rolling my eyes and saying, you have a need that's making you say that. I don't respect you for it. I was judging.
Yeah.
And so, and then you think about someone who is having an orientation based on judgment about something as fundamental and unprovable one way or the other, really, as spirituality. then you think about what that person's mentality is like, particularly if that's someone like me that was mercenary. And as you mentioned earlier, I was someone that believed that as a consequence of being a purely material entity, the idea of a soul was ridiculous.
Mhm.
I did not believe I had a soul. I didn't believe anyone had a soul. And that left me with sort of that foundational emptiness and rage that you discussed at the top of the hour when you gave my bio. It's
Right.
a place that I ultimately had to wake up and get out of. It was hard along the way, but it was a place that I dwelled in for a long time. It ain't a pretty place.
Well, rage is an interesting thing, because for me, what I observe is someone who is in such a level of anger is someone who is feeling so unconnected,
Yeah.
so alone, and so lost. They have no place else to go. They feel so unheard
Yeah.
that they are screaming to be heard. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's one other component of that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about as well, which is a gender component. I also wholly bought into, and it's ironic, but I wholly bought into the idea that there were only certain types of emotions that I, as a man, could legitimately have. And I say it's a little bit weird. I admit it myself because I'm LGBTQ whatever. And so, right, in a way, one would intuitively say, well, Scott, why were you, as a member of the LGBTQAI community, buying into heteronormative gender expectations? And to me, that sort of does go as to the difference. There's sometimes sexual orientation and gender identity are conflated. They're not, as I'm sure many trans people would say, they're not the same. And it certainly was not experienced that way to me. So although I had this particular sexual orientation in terms of how I viewed myself as a spirit, how I viewed myself as a gendered person in the world, I absolutely thought that feeling sadness, feeling compassion, feeling love were things as a male I couldn't even contemplate.
That is
Rage was acceptable
definitely,
though.
yes, definitely. And that's what you're suppressing all your emotions. So the rage is the only outlet you have.
Yeah.
Right. So that is mostly a male, and it's mostly programming. Right. It is not necessarily genetic. There is a little bit of geneticism in there, but for the most part,
Yeah.
it is, suck it up, be a big boy, be a man. Right. And for I was told the same thing, by the way.
Mhm.
I can remember almost getting beat up by a gang. It was me and a gang, and some folks rescued me. And I got home and I was telling my father, and his response was, "You should have fought them."
Mhm.
And I'm like, 5-1, Dad? I think that's pretty stupid.
Yeah.
If it was
Yeah.
1-1, yes, I would have held my own. But 5-1, no, you run.
Right. Don't invite right the triage room in the
Right.
hospital
Right.
for no
Right.
reason.
Right. So I had a little bit of that as well, and probably contributed to my anger. I was a very angry person for a long time. And would I admit the anger? Absolutely not. I just finished writing a chapter in an anthology that will be coming out in December.
Oh, cool.
And in that anthology, it's Women of Healing. And the woman that invited me to join said, I'd like you to join this. I said, well, I'm not a healer. She said, you're an emotional healer. And I said, okay, well, let me talk then about my abandonment issues, because if you ever asked me, what are you doing about your abandonment issues? I would say, what abandonment issues are you talking about? I have no abandonment issues. I'm a strong woman. I have control over my life. I don't feel abandoned. So, of course, my mom died when I was like 3. Abandoned. So I wrote this chapter, and what it did, Scott, and this is something that folks can do, I took pieces of my story that I've told. I've talked about, my mom tried to abort me and failed. She died when I was 3. I had issues with my father and how I was, a burden, and evidence of that, and so on. And all of these evidence, but they were separate stories. In this anthology, I chained them together and went, no wonder I was so angry, right? And without a spiritual anchor to turn to, I was lost as well.
I have to comment after hearing that wonderful story that what you said to my ears goes back to an earlier theme that we touched on very lightly when this conversation started. That is in the nexus of myth and religion.
Right.
Abandonment as a child is a recurring and foundational mythical theme that relates to the development of heroism. I, for instance, was put up for adoption as a child. I was born in England, and my parents were in the military. My adoptive parents, they were in the military, and they brought me over the Atlantic Ocean and raised me here in the United States. Why do I mention that detail? Because a common mythical theme related to abandonment of a child, particularly a male child, is a crossing of water. In some cases, like Perseus in Greek mythology, it's literally the child being tossed into the ocean. In the case of the Bible with Moses, he's thrown into the river and in a basket, and then adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter. In your case, the abandonment may not have been literal in that sense, but abandonment is perhaps, as a common theme, the initial sign of a struggle that the ultimate hero is going to have to endure, as well as an opportunity for the displacement of the identity to begin, something that puts them outside of the norm, which sets them up to later defy and recreate the norm.
And what's interesting in that piece of your conversation, I never felt normal, like I was normal. My fascination was actually with the Amazon women, and my nickname at 13, because I was so much taller than the boys, was Amazon woman.
Wow. Now,
Yes.
I've got to ask, how did you take that? That could have been either I'm really going to run with this, or that could have been, depending on the disposition of the young woman, very, very hurtful. I mean, look, when I was growing up, the tall girl, that was like an insult.
So being the tallest for a long time, thank goodness I stopped growing, was ridiculous. But the nickname Amazon woman, I felt that the Amazon women were powerful. They were brilliant. They had their own community. Atlantis is also a community that I relate to, as are the early pharaohs, right? They're all, so yours is mythology. I'm a little bit out there as well.
Are you calling me out there? I'll embrace that.
Yes.
I'll take it.
No, thank you.
We didn't cross the water for nothing.
No. And then the water anthology, I have a friend she is a shaman, however you want to say it, from an African tribe. So it's African. And their circle, everyone has a certain element that they are. And as a circle, all of the elements have to be in circle for the circle to function, right? And water, you have to have, she said, 4 times water, because water helps with the flow. I'm water. So that's really interesting, because when she asked me to describe what that meant to me, my description was, well, I've been the iceberg. I've been the tsunami, right? I've been the tidal wave, and I've been the quiet lake.
Have you even been the steam too?
I've been the steam and I've been the river, and I am the river right now.
Mhm. I love all of those. It's interesting, again, sort of turning the conversation a little bit. My personal avatar, as we've discussed, is Helios, the sun
Right.
god.
Yes.
Helios gets in his chariot and with his horses, and he goes up to the top of the firmament every day. He provides light and nourishment to the earth, then he goes down underneath it. What does he do at the end of his journey? He sinks beneath the water that circles the world. And then he crosses a separate river in a gold cup while he's asleep until he hits his other palace and then does a little bit of prep and then goes and circles the earth again. Going as to then a couple of things. First of all, the necessity of the submergence of knowledge and light into water for the completion of the Earth's enlightenment, growth, and other needs to occur. But also the traverse of the solar figure, again, which represents illumination, knowledge, enlightenment, and nourishment on the bed of water in order for it to function. The water represents the subterranean, but it also represents the subconscious. It
Right.
represents motion. It represents power, as you've indicated. So what I'm also hearing about your role, and it makes sense in light of what I know of your story, is that there is a support nature to it, yet it is also foundational. It covers the surface, but it also affects what is beneath the surface. And as we talked about with steam, it can even translate and go to the top of the earth and then rain down on it, again, giving a different sort of nourishment than light might be able to provide.
Right. Right. It's very interesting how we are all represented in a variety of ways.
Yeah.
We are all different and yet the same.
Yeah.
Right. And so how did you come across using mythology as a means of discovering your inner spirituality and your
Thank you.
outer spirituality?
Thank you. So talking about diving beneath the ocean of the subconscious at the end of the journey up to the top and then down from the firmament. When I was around 9 years old, my family, I grew up in Kansas, like I mentioned earlier, we went on a trip to the big city of Denver, Colorado, walking through the downtown, and there was a bookstore, and we went into this bookstore. I'll never forget it, Gail. I saw next to the cashier station this book called Delairy's Book of Greek Myths. It was a big lithographed illustration book of Greek myths, and on the cover was Helios, the god of the sun, flying over some nymphs and satyrs that were dancing. I was riveted. I remember exactly where that was placed to this day. I only had $12 to my name. And yes, I spent my entire vacation money, that $12 on that book. And by the way, it is to this day right by my desk. So Helios and mythology spoke to me like a thunderbolt the minute I saw it. Now, I suppressed that. I never lost the interest in it. And in fact, when I traveled, for instance, a lot before the pandemic, I would always find a way to travel to archaeological sites that had Greco-Roman ruins. Or
Right.
when I would do reading, I would somewhere or another always return to reading. And when I would talk or give speeches, I always found a way to work those things in. It wasn't until I went through my own submersion, my own crash out of this hardcore atheistic approach to things, which was not working for me, either as a spiritual matter or as an externalization of my inside into the outside world matter, that I began a journey to recover who was at my core. And eventually, as I began to round about to who and what I needed to be, as opposed to what I wanted to be through the supposed liberation of from any sort of connection to any forward motion in life besides the ego, that I realized that this had been a theme in my life from all along. I literally urge the clients I work with, Gail, when they're seeking to uncover their own unique reason for being, I tell them we're going to go on a trip to the Oracle. And as part of that trip to the inner Oracle, we do an inside archaeological dig to uncover the gemstones that have been suppressed that represent who and what you are. And I know that that works because that's what I did, and Helios and the rest of the myths all came out. Connected with them, and now I'm able to connect with others.
Isn't that fantastic? It really is, and it's not fantasy fantastic.
Right.
It is amazing fantastic,
Yeah.
right? You know, so many people, there are so many different tools on this journey to healing.
Yes.
But there's a common thread for all of it, and that common thread is that you have to leave ego behind.
Yes.
You have to be brave enough to be curious and admit that what you believe to be true may not be true.
Yeah.
And not let your world fall apart.
Yeah. As dear as it might feel to you. Yes. I think the only thing that I would add to that, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it, is that as important as it is to leave that ego behind, to go on that journey, one can't self-abnegate to the point that you're willing to reject the call. I firmly believe that the universe, Providence, gave us each a unique set of skills and talents and experiences. And it is a moral/ethical obligation for us to step into it and not to run from it. Perhaps, though, running and saying, I know better than Providence is yet another manifestation of ego itself. And if that's the case, then, you know, that's your counterpoint to me.
So I'll talk about when I work with clients on emotion. So emotion is the perfect example to talk about what I mean when I say leaving ego at the door. Ego is part of who you are. We are an integrated being. So to ignore ego is to ignore the inner child. And that's a slap in the face. What I do, though, with my clients who are, let's say, okay, so you're coming to a session. So let's talk about this week. Oh, I was so angry and so frustrated. This happened. Okay, let's talk about the specifics of the incident. And I want to know what you are physically feeling, not emotionally feeling. Because you see, your emotions are not present day. They are a manifestation of your past. You see, you go, I'm angry. Oh, okay. I have an angry folder. Let me open up my angry folder. Oh, in the past, when I was angry, this is how I responded. Okay, so I'm angry. So this is how I'm going to respond. Right. So you bring all in, right? Love, hate, shame, all of that has a little folder that you go to.
Yeah.
If you don't name it and you just sit in the moment and get curious about it, where in your body is it? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it sharp? Is it dull? Without giving it a name or a label, you can experience it and release it. And it's not with the intention of releasing it. It's with the intention of experiencing it new every time.
There's so much embedded in what you just said. It's hard to even know where to begin. I will say, though, that one of the areas that I manifested particularly during this super militantly atheistic period, my desire for ego-driven outcomes and that approaches domination of my life was through attempts to control the body, to make myself as fit as possible, to make sure that the inner resolve that I was, or the inner toughness that I was determined to dominate me, or the inner hardness, I should say, externalized through an external countenance that I felt matched it. And ultimately, then that leads to destruction. And in the case of people who take it a long way, I mean, you know, it can literally lead to death. And you see that happening with extreme athletes all the time.
Yeah.
You're also talking about, by the way, the ways in which, on a different level, not dealing with these things can also manifest itself as other external physical dysfunctions. So for a long time, for instance, I had rosacea. During all of this period, I had accelerating rosacea on my face. Now you notice right now, and I'm not wearing any makeup or anything. I don't have any soft focus on. I don't have Vaseline on the lens like they did in 1940s Hollywood, which I'm at age 26, far too young to remember. But that being said, why? Because the overall spiritual transformation gave my body the room to heal by not suppressing and holding all of these things. The outplay of that, as well as other physical dysfunctions that I was experiencing, went away.
Right. Isn't that crazy?
It's ridiculous.
Right. Right. I mean, I had physical ailments as well that no longer manifest themselves. Now, some of it is through healthier eating, for sure, you know, absolutely. But a lot of it is because I'm not hanging on to tension anymore. And do I get angry? Do I get frustrated? Of course I do. Right. I am human, and I do have interaction with other humans, and I do have expectations that may or may not be met. But I do know that I own that, not you. And so when I have that feeling, it's first, okay, is this present or past? Am I feeling something for the moment, or am I bringing a story forward? If I'm bringing a story forward, I don't want, that's the story. That's done. If it's the present, okay, my feelings are telling me something. They're telling me something is not cool.
You said something in passing that I can't resist going back to for a second.
I love you.
So the bait you gave is the bait I'm biting. You just didn't realize you were throwing out some bait, maybe. We were talking about even healthy meat eating.
Right.
Let's talk about that for a second. What are we doing when we make choices about what we put into our body that are dangerous or unhealthy? We are yet again reflecting, manifesting how we envision our internal state.
Right.
And, you know, with this avatar of mine, Helios, which of course is not all encompassing, but one of the things that the sun represents is the source of nourishment. The idea of the sunlight both being and representing intellectual illumination, intellectual nourishment, and physical nourishment through its ability to enable plants that are one of the foundational pillars of healthy eating to grow, represents to me a connection between the intellectual, the physical, and the spiritual. I might add, lies and untruths cannot withstand the light of the sun, which is why Helios, my avatar, was known as the guardian of oaths. When we consume things that represent a negative view about ourselves, what are we doing? We are actually, in a way, violating a caretaking oath that we, I believe, should be following through with vis-a-vis ourselves.
Right. So, so much packed into that. so much packed into that. I just don't know where to begin. So for me, do you know that truth is who I am? I've I talked to you a little bit about the fifth
Yes, you
dimension
did.
and soul realignment work, and my God-given gift is truth.
Mhm.
And so you can imagine how I react to lies. And I lied to myself for many years. Why was I physically? Why did I have ulcers at 12? Why did I have, tonsillitis throughout most of my life? Why did I have the
Mhm.
illnesses and the problems that I had? It was because I wasn't honoring who I am
Mhm.
at a soul level,
Yeah.
right? Of course, I didn't know who I was, but if I had listened to my body
Yeah.
and how your body will tell you first that there's resistance here,
Yeah.
right? And if you listen to, we talked earlier, the tap on the shoulder
Yeah.
and say, okay, I hear you. And I literally will say, I hear you. Okay. I'm not going to question it. I'm going to go do it. Right. If you don't do that, eventually, like you and I talked about, you'll be thrown through a brick wall to
Right.
wake up.
Right.
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 Yeah.
The story of, there are different versions of this myth throughout mythologies
Mhm.
across the board. Two that people are going to be familiar with are the myth of the fall of the Titans in Greek mythology. A more famous version of this myth is the war in heaven and the downfall of Lucifer in the Bible.
Right.
Now, the Greek mythological version is that, for those that don't know, is that there was an early race of primordial deities called the Titans. And Zeus and the Olympians that most people are more familiar with as the Greek gods were their children. And those children eventually overthrew the Titans, and they cast them down into the underworld where they dwell to this day. The chief of the Titans was named Cronus, also known as Saturn. He was more or less the god of time. In order to prevent his own downfall, because a prophet had told him that this exact thing would happen, he literally ate his children. The god of time was eating his own progeny. In other words, he was resisting change. The oracle was that tap on the shoulder that you were talking about. The passed down to Tartarus, where the god of time and his cohorts ended up for all eternity, was the cost of ignoring that tap on the shoulder.
Right.
You think about it, even the story of Lucifer in the Bible. He had, as an angel, the gift of foreknowledge. He knew God was all powerful, yet still rebelled. He ignored the light that had created him and ended up thrown down harshly and permanently into the underworld,
Into the dark,
into the dark, hell, the absence of God.
the absence of God. And from my perspective, I am a student of the universal laws, and the universal law of polarity will tell you cannot have up without down, light
Yes.
without dark, good without evil. Yes, good without evil. And so evil has its what we call evil, because the evildoers do not think they're evil.
Yeah.
They have a very logical to them reason for what they're doing.
Yeah.
And we could go down a rabbit hole with that one.
Oh, yes, we could.
Yes, we could, right? It may not be our morals, but all of it is made up.
Yeah.
All of it is made up.
Yeah.
But you can't, you don't understand. I don't understand how much I've grown, how much light I am without first having been in the dark.
Mhm.
I wouldn't know the difference,
Mhm.
right? I, as a coach, as a mentor, as a teacher, I couldn't understand where you're coming from if I haven't felt that pain as well.
As the sun cannot rise without that journey through the underworld.
Right.
Gail, there's a program that I have called Charismatic Olympian. I work with people to help develop their presences as really energetic exciting public speakers. It's not my main program, but it's something that I do. And one challenge that I have seen with certain people that are seeking to speak or become better speakers is that they are comfortable presenting the light to the world, but they're uncomfortable with the darkness, expressing through their speaking styles a rejection of that exact polarity that you just discussed.
Right.
I've told people, and I tell people again and again and again, if you really want to have a full charismatic presence, grab a knife, take it to your gut, slice it open, pull out your intestines, throw them on the table, and tell the world to look. And people react usually very, with a look on their face.
Right.
And I'll say, yes, that's dramatic. Yes, that's gory, gruesome, and shocking. And yes, you need to hear that, because politely telling people to explore the dark, people don't hear it. There's such a social bias against that. But if you're willing to tap into that and bring it out and express fully how it was to experience that and embrace that as part of your journey, then you have tapped into the core of charisma. What is charisma to me, Gail? There's a specific technical definition I have of it, but really what it is when you are filtering that providential light and radiating it to the world, where you're like a prism and it's coming through you and then shooting out and the world's taking it in. But exactly what you're talking about is essential.
Absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. And for many people, they either identify with the negative. So there's the person who's overwhelmed, and guess what? The next day they're even more overwhelmed, and the next day they're even more overwhelmed because they identify with being overwhelmed and it serves them. Right. And then there are people who are, I call them the Pollyannas, right? Who don't even admit that, that evil happens or that bad things happen. And they live in a land that no one wants either one of them around.
Yeah.
Right. Because they're both only seeing the world halfway.
Yeah.
Halfway. Right. During the last school shooting, I was coaching a woman who is the leader in a company that works with teenagers who are at risk. And right after her and I talked, and I said, well, there is a child that no one listened to for so long that he had to explode. There's a child that your organization could have helped if you could have gotten to him sooner. Not in high school, not in junior high, but 6 and 7 years old. And that anger was starting to boil over. Right. And no one was listening to him.
Yeah.
Right. And she said, you're absolutely right. I said, it's not gun control. It's seeing the anguish and holding a safe space for that to be expressed.
There was a school shooting that occurred many years ago. It was by 2 young boys. I think it was maybe in Boulder, Colorado, maybe Columbine. I don't remember, but I think it was Columbine. But what I remember was this: one of them had begun to collect sort of neo-Nazi paraphernalia and had zillions of guns in his room. And his parents were just sort of like around. I don't know, maybe, I grew up in a military family, so I couldn't even sneak in a handkerchief, let alone 10 guns. But that goes as to me, at least based on the facts that I know, sort of a Pollyanna attitude. Oh, I don't want to see that. That's making me uncomfortable. That's scaring me, what I'm seeing about my child. So let me focus on the dishes instead.
Right.
And that is truly dangerous. We were talking before the show, Gail, about some dreams. I had a dream just last night that involved New York City suffering through a nuclear bomb after a series of other bombs that had been conducted on it in this dream by Vladimir Putin. And I was trying to escape. And my husband and I were sheltering in an already bombed out concrete building. And I remember like screaming as this huge airplane was going above us, "If there is light, close your eyes," because I knew that if he saw a nuclear bomb, he'd go blind. And of course, I woke up in a start after all that. And as I was processing that dream and even thinking about what you were saying about the school shootings and Pollyanna versus dwelling in the negative, it can be tempting to move into either of those directions because the horror of the world situation that we're living in, if you really think about it, is so overwhelming. But speaking again of myths consistently have heroes that either accept the challenges that they are given, or cautionary tales like Adam and Eve,
Right.
or other, in Greek mythology in particular has a lot of them, of people who choose to reject the opportunities to rise or to develop that are presented to them by the gods.
Mhm.
One of the great temptations that we have if we're living a life of relative safety is to move into one of those extremes without taking the time to intellectually navigate through it, to face it, but to face it in a way that's healthy and enables us to assert whatever sort of agency that we can within the circumstances that we're in. That itself is a very, very difficult emotional and intellectual exercise, but it's part of what I view as the test that we living in a society of relative privilege are given. I always say I'm biracial, and one of the tests that I feel as a person of color in the United States we have to deal with is dealing with racism. But one of the tests that white people have to deal with is dealing with living as a privileged individual within a society that's racist. All sides have responsibility there. All sides have the opportunity to develop. And by the way, what you do, even as a person of color with racism, how do I respond to that? Do I move into a place of Pollyanna? Oh, racism doesn't exist. The world is rose petals. Or is that consuming everything and I can't move beyond it? The only thing I think about is racism. Or do I go through the hard work of a more complex intellectual and emotional a process and approach to it? The same goes for those that are not the victims of racism. Do I pretend that it's not there? Do I dwell on it? Or do I go through a process of being a constructive force in the world in light of these larger systemic issues?
The
Go ahead.
work is where we have become so lazy
Yeah,
that we don't want to do the work.
yeah,
And life is work.
yes.
That's what it is. It absolutely is. And I will tell you, I'll give you a quick story on racism. I grew up inner city, so I hung out with everybody. I didn't understand that there were dividing lines, right? I was working in a company, and one of my peers was a Black woman, and her and I, Cynthia, were friends. She came to me one day and she goes, I'm quitting. I'm getting another job. And I said, why? I thought you liked what you do. And she said, well, our boss is a racist. And I just can't deal with it. And I said, how so? I watch you interact. And she said, she is so afraid of me that she can't even reprimand me when I should be.
Wow.
I said, she's afraid of you. She said, yes, that white little ass is afraid of me. And I'm like, wow, that is amazing that she picked up on. I want to be treated like Gail. I want to be treated like George. I want to be treated like everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Not with she was trying to be careful in order not to be racist. And in that act, she's being racist.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we talk about this, and this is a whole other conversation, I look at people as people because I was raised inner city. I was raised with, blacks, black, yellow, green, purple. It didn't matter to me. I didn't see that there was a difference really, until I was an adult. And then it was confusing to me. I don't understand, but I do understand if I were a Black woman, the issues that I would have to face that I didn't have to face as a privileged, if you say, white woman, right? Life would have been even that much more difficult. It was hard enough as it was for me to be accepted for how smart I was and for the capabilities I had. Right? If I were a Black woman, it would have been even harder.
Yeah. Acknowledging that sort of differential in experience and the implications and ways it can play out across a whole range of identity markers, not to mention other human variances that can significantly alter experience, is what you said a few minutes ago. Hard work. Hard work. But wow, to be able to engage with it, and going back to our theme of ego, engage with it without ego, can also take your ability to understand and connect with others to a whole different level. Why are we each here as human beings? It's hard to argue that Providence, or whatever it is that gave us those unique sets of skills and experiences that I referenced earlier, gave them to us so that they could be utilized or expressed in isolation without it impacting or affecting anybody else. Otherwise, we wouldn't be a social species. There aren't a lot of people that are hermits.
Right. It's impossible. It's impossible. We're not only are we social beings, but we are connected to a universal mind.
Yeah.
We are emotionally, spiritually connected, whether we want to admit it or not.
Totally. And so the pro-social nature of the work that we're talking about in the field of sort of these identity-related relations, or when it comes to just connecting with other people and building a better self, is foundational to, I think, who we are as human beings.
Absolutely. Well, Scott, holy crap. We could go on forever, but I want to wrap this up, and we're going to meet again.
We're never wrapping this one up. We're going to have
oh my God.
10 more 8-hour episodes. And then we'll say we started.
Seriously. So Scott, tell us how people can get in touch with you.
Thank you. So you can reach out. You can follow me, first of all, on LinkedIn or Instagram. On LinkedIn, just look up the Myth Slayer, one word. On Instagram, it's s.scott_MASON. That's s.scott_MASON. If you are interested in talking more about how Greek mythology can help you magnetize or monetize professional freedom, I just tell folks, reach out to me through DM using one of those platforms, and I will give you a free consultation. Just say Gail sent you. That word, Gail, that carries a lot of currency with your homeboy here. The other thing too is I have a website that is under construction now, but will be out very, very soon, perhaps by the time this is published, called myfreedomrocks.com. myfreedomrocks.com. And Gail, I ask you, does your freedom rock?
Always. You betcha, baby. You betcha. And all of this stuff will be in the show notes for you guys. And thank you again, Scott, and everyone. Thank you for listening to the Empowering Process podcast. If you really like this, please do subscribe. If you know someone who might actually learn something from this, share it out to them. If you have a question because of this crazy conversation, which just touched on things that we could go deep into, let us know. Maybe we'll get back together and answer your question. But always, thank you for sharing your time with us. And this is Gail Craft. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Scott.
Now, welcome your host, Gail Craft. Thank you for listening to the Empowering Process podcast. Be sure to visit Gail at gailcraft.com to learn more about how she serves thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and goal seekers. And remember, if you like this broadcast, be sure to share and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.